God's ministry for racial justice. So let me share my screen. All right, so in lies my teacher told me, everything your American history textbook got wrong. James W. Lowen finds several problems with how slavery is taught in high schools across the United States. Lowen observes that white Americans, at least at the time of his writing in the mid-1990s, and we can talk about how much things have changed in 2020, 2021, but he observes that white Americans remained perpetually startled at slavery. Even many years after high school, he found that white adults were aghast when confronted with the horror and pervasiveness of slavery in the US past. It seemed to him that white adults, or at least many of them, didn't learn or too quickly forgot that George Washington, for example, and Thomas Jefferson were among the multitudes of white Americans who owned enslaved Black persons as their human property. Lowen surmised that the ignorance of white Americans on slavery, for him, he traced it back to high school classrooms. He argued that history textbooks incorrectly presented slavery as, in his words, an uncaused tragedy that minimized white complicity and activity in the enslavement of Black Americans. He, in his reading of these textbooks, he saw that high school students were meant to feel sadness for the plight of, for example, nearly 4 million enslaved Black persons in 1860, but not anger toward the approximately 390,000 white enslavers, because these enslavers and their unjust actions didn't really appear in the pages of the textbook. Since Lowen published his book in 1995, there have been strides to improve our teaching and learning on slavery. Yet, the backlash against a more comprehensive curriculum on slavery and anti-Black prejudice reveals the need for an assessment, I think, of how congregations like yours and seminaries like mine are engaging these educational debates around slavery, racism, and racial justice in American history. As I reflect on my experiences, first as a theological student and now as a theological educator, I'm more than concerned, I'm actually quite convinced that seminary classrooms are also failing to provide instruction that properly captures the totality of white Christian involvement in slavery and anti-Black racism. The perpetual shock, for example, among some of our students here at Columbia Seminary, and in some of not Swarthmore Presbyterian, but in some of the congregations that I've had the pleasure of visiting in person and virtually, the perpetual shock over some basic historical facts about slavery is alarming to me. One pernicious myth that I've encountered is the notion that most white Christians in the antebellum period were abolitionists pushing for the immediate emancipation of enslaved Black persons. This is simply not true. Very few white Christians held this position, and there was little support for immediate emancipation in, for example, the Baptist, Episcopalian, Methodist, and Presbyterian denominations. Many white Christians, including white Presbyterians in the southern states, for example, defended slavery so vigorously that some Black and white abolitionists identified white churches as actually the most impenetrable strongholds against their cause. Benjamin Morgan Palmer, a white Presbyterian pastor in New Orleans, who had previously taught at Columbia Theological Seminary, preached in 1860 that slavery was a providential trust that whites must preserve and perpetuate because the natural condition of Black Americans was servitude. Palmer mocked Northern abolitionists for thinking that Black persons could survive alongside whites as equals. Here's the thing, though. Palmer was neither reviled nor rebuked for his, I think what we can say are white supremacist views. Rather, he was widely celebrated, and he was elected to serve as the first moderator of the newly formed Presbyterian Church of the Confederate States of America in December 1861. I've recently discovered also he was one of the highest paid clergy in 1860. I think the average salary for a clergy person, and generally, sadly, back then it was mostly a clergyman, was $600, $600 to $800. Presbyterian clergy, some were paid more, up to about $12,000 US in 1860. Benjamin Morgan Palmer at First Presbyterian Church in New Orleans, his annual salary in 1860 was $4,000. So just to compare that with. We can talk more about that in a moment. So Black Christians like Frederick Douglass and Sojourner Truth and Theodore S. Wright, the first Black graduate at Princeton Theological Seminary, class of 1828, emphasized the eradication of anti-Black racism was an essential component in their abolitionism. But even white Christian abolitionists in the northern states fell woefully short in their advocacy against anti-Black racism. So for some abolitionists, including Presbyterian abolitionists in the northern states, they really try to differentiate or even separate the causes of abolition and anti-Black racism. So their argument was for abolition. Certainly slavery is a wrong that goes against the precepts of the Bible, but we are not advocating for the eradication of prejudice and anti-Black racism. So again, I'll talk more in a moment about, I think for my students and I, when we study it today, it seems like, it just seems like a very strange, peculiar argument. How can you be for one but against the other? But one hint that I've shared with my students and in my own research and writing that helps me understand how they were able to differentiate or separate the two is from Archibald Alexander. I think he was the first appointed professor at Princeton Theological Seminary when it began in the 1810s. He was moderator of the Presbyterian Church in the USA Denomination General Assembly, 1807. And so in 1846, he wrote, and so he was one of these, I am against slavery, but I am also not advocating for civil rights and equal rights for Black persons. So what he said is he, along with some of his colleagues and many white Presbyterians in northern states, they favored or endorsed what was known as the American Colonization Society, or the ACS. It was this movement to send free Black Americans to Liberia. And so it had several motivations. At one level, the motivation was world mission, that we want Presbyterians, for example, among other Protestant denominations in the 1820s, 1830s, 1840s, 1850s, they were sending white missionaries to China and to other parts of Asia and to, in particular, West Africa. And so it was this idea, who would make for the best missionaries? Like, who are the best candidates that can serve God and spread and share the good news of the Christian gospel in Africa? And it was this idea that perhaps Black Americans, African Americans, were the best missionaries because they did not have a different skin color as the people that they were seeking to serve and share the gospel among. And also there was a kind of public health reason. Perhaps they would be less susceptible to the diseases that some white missionaries were falling ill and succumbing even to death to. So that was one. But another reason, and this is something Alexander and Robert Finley, he was actually probably the founder of the American Colonization Society in 1816, 1817. It was solving not only the call of world mission, if you will, in West Africa, but it was the problem of anti-Black racism in the northern states. He felt, Alexander as well as Finley, that the discriminatory contempt that he saw many white Americans hold against Black Americans, in his words, it was simply too insurmountable to overcome. And of course, that's hard to grapple with, I'm gonna be honest. I think, so what do I take from that? One is, initially there's a lot of rebuke, right? For me as a historian, this idea that to suggest that a sin is too great so that the proper Presbyterian Reformed Christian response is to give up seems antithetical to everything we know and hold dear about the Christian gospel. So, and I think that's appropriate evaluative assessment or judgment. But I think as a historian, what it also reveals to me is the severity, ferocity, tenacity of anti-Black prejudice. I think as a historian looks back and looks at discourses like Archibald Alexander, it really does reveal the prevalence of anti-Black prejudice and racial discrimination among white populations in the northern states. And of course, Alexander wasn't the only one to say this. In Democracy in America, Alexis de Tocqueville, the French political theorist, I think it's 1828, 1820s, he wrote it. He also noted in Philadelphia, not too far from where you all are, in Swarthmore Presbyterian Church, the severity and the tenacity and just the ugliness of white prejudice against Black persons, the Black population. And so even de Tocqueville noted that even if abolition were to happen, it seemed to him that there was also an adjoining problem of how to tackle racial discrimination against Black Americans, that abolition alone would not solve the problem. So this was kind of Alexander and others, that was their approach. It was this idea of, in some ways, the solution was, how do we remove free Black persons from the northern states? I think another example of this is in Ohio, and this was something that pro-slavery Presbyterians, this was one of their retorts, if you will, against white abolitionists, was, so you want us to free all of the enslaved Black persons in our southern states. What will happen once they are free? They are not allowed to own property in many of your northern states. They're not allowed to have the same access to protection like firearms that white citizens do. And for example, states like Ohio, they had the Ohio Black Laws, 1807, I think, that really the aim of the laws were to make it so undesirable and so difficult for free Black persons to live in the state that they wouldn't come. So that was part of what was all going on then. But let me move forward for now, and then we can touch upon this. So again, for Alexander, it was this idea, as he understood it, perhaps it would be better for all free Black Americans to leave the United States and find another home where their skin color would not be despised and held against them. So that was what was happening then. I think in many cases, and thinking today, and we'll talk in a moment, I don't know that seminary classrooms, and we can talk some about, I guess, Sunday school congregational classrooms, I don't think we treat slavery as an uncaused tragedy in the same way that Lowen read it into high school textbooks. Some of us who are parents of middle and high school children, we could probably also compare. I have an 8th grade daughter, and I can compare her education compared to mine, and it is vastly different in terms of how she is learning about US history. But I do think that some of our teaching and learning, at least in theological education in seminaries like mine, continue to minimize white Christian complicity and misdirect the anger students should feel about slavery, rather than fully grappling with the histories and legacies of economic exploitation, sexual violence, and virulent anti-Black racism perpetrated in some cases by white American Christians. Students are left with a neatly packaged lesson on slavery centered on the dangers of bad or deficient biblical interpretation. Like the biggest lesson I feel like I came away with in seminary, and even I wonder some of our students at Columbia come with when we study the past and slavery and anti-Black racism is, oh, the Bible can be used as a dangerous weapon. So we shouldn't proof text, and we shouldn't isolate a few verses and take them out of context and use them and wield them against, other people. I think, so some of my students immediately look at the recent debates and divisions over LGBTQ plus inclusion and human sexuality, and they draw parallels right away. Like Christians today are using the verses, different verses, but in the same way. And I think that's not like a bad lesson, right? That's a good lesson to have. But I think to too quickly skip over what really happened, like the depth of the complicity. And in some cases, for example, at a seminary like mine, the active defense and participation and ownership of enslaved Black persons that white Presbyterians in and around and involved with Columbia Seminary held, like that part is kind of just, I don't want to say it's glossed over, but it's not grappled with in the way I feel as though it should if it's going to be helpful. I feel like such instruction that emphasizes biblical interpretation, as good as those lessons are, actually fails to make the crucial point that the abolitionists in the 1840s and 50s themselves made, which was to identify and confront the anti-Black racism that white Christians held. For example, and I'll end with this, in 1845, in Frederick Douglass, a formerly enslaved person who escaped enslavement in Baltimore, Maryland in the 1830s. In 1845, he published his narrative or autobiography. Here's an 1847 edition, and that differentiated between what he called genuine Christianity, and in his words, quote, the corrupt, slaveholding, woman-whipping, cradle-plundering, partial and hypocritical Christianity of this land, end quote, in his narrative. So that's kind of where we are. And I think in our ongoing pursuit of anti-racism and racial justice today, I think perhaps in the world that I inhabit, which is theological education first, I think we need to engage in a more complete kind of understanding of the history, and so that we can move forward from there. I think it's difficult. I think, and I'll end with this. So I will say in our classrooms, I think one common refrain is we agree with Frederick Douglass that that's not Christianity. But then what perhaps is more difficult is, I think perhaps there's common agreement about that. I think, and everyone here on this Zoom might agree with that. But it's wrestling with the fact that that's true, that was false, that was a hypocritical Christianity, that it was an evil version of Christianity, if you will. But what we can't say is that, but Christians still were involved in it. I think another answer some of my students and we want to say is, but they really weren't Christians, right? The women and men who participated in and owned and beat and defended Black enslavement. And I think maybe we don't know the answer to that question of whether they were Christians or not, although many of my students are fairly convinced they were not. But I think for me as a historian, what I can't say is that they self-identified as Christians. They were recognized as Christians. Others saw them as Christians. Presbyterians like Benjamin Morgan Palmer were revered and highly regarded clergy. They were moderators, they were missionaries, they were stated clerks. They were involved at every level of the Presbyterian Church, capital C. So yes, we can say, so what does that mean, right? So we can say, okay, they weren't Christians or that wasn't Christianity. But I don't know, and I'll conclude with this. I don't think we can say that wasn't Presbyterianism. I just don't think that's historically true. I think historically we can say that was the wrong kind or a bad kind of Presbyterianism. And we can certainly point to the good and the virtuous and the heroic and the courageous witness of Presbyterian abolitionists. And to say that was certainly also true, and we can honor their witness and their legacy. But at the same time, I think a historical approach in seminaries and maybe congregation like yours has been not holding them in tension, but simply lifting up one and kind of see, the other one just kind of disappears from view. And maybe, and I'm going to stop sharing my screen here now and we can hang out some. Yeah, sorry, I went over, but yeah, so all these are the questions I'm asking. I don't know that I have a lot of answers to these questions yet. For example, for my last point, I do think there's been a lot of elevating the good in Presbyterian history, but it's been minimizing or just totally deleting the bad. Maybe that is the best way forward. Maybe the bad is so bad and so evil, it's not worth even like discussing. It's not worth even like remembering or acknowledging. But then, and maybe like, I don't know, as an ethicist or as a theologian, that sounds pretty good. But as a historian, that's not very satisfying to me because we can ignore it, but their legacy is still with us, right? So then it's not as if we don't know and we can't feel the present consequences of this kind of evil Presbyterian witness. And so I guess the question for all of us is like, what do we do with that? But I'm going to end there and we can hang out and talk some. Thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Yu. And I invite you all to put yourselves on the gallery view again so we can see each other. And thank you for laying out that history and the really important distinctions and the questions that you raise. And I appreciate, you pointing back at the seminary, but I also think, right, that invites us to point back at our understandings in the church as well. So I know that Dr. Yu is really interested in engaging us in conversation around what he's laid out here and then what that stimulates for us in thought. So I would invite questions at this point. And Susan, yeah, do you have?
Thank you. So I'm not sure how clear this will be because there's so much going on in my head, but one place to begin, I think, is if you are advocating a reckoning, and it sounds like maybe that is something you would like to see, at least in seminary, and if that could be done, how do you see it being done? And I guess the second part of the question is, since we are so still living in such a segregated world during worship on Sunday mornings, what do you see happening anywhere in the country where white and Black Christians, Presbyterians in particular, are coming together to kind of talk through these issues? And I'm not suggesting that Black Christians teach white Christians about what they go through. That's not what I'm talking about. What I'm asking is, do you see where there are fruitful conversations between Black and white Christians as part of a reckoning process? And do you see that working? If it's happening, does it seem to work?
Oh, hey, Susan, thanks. No, that's a really good question. I think, so I was asking Sarah in the minutes before we started about your congregation. And so I think, I don't know that there's a one size fits all, right, solution or prescription, if you will. So I can share one thing that is discouraging to me before to get to the encouraging parts is certainly there are a lot of efforts that are not working. I think that is clear. I think, for example, even, and I don't know how much of the really fierce school board educational debates that are happening in states like yours and mine and everywhere about critical race theory and how it's kind of evolved. I think, so I think one challenge, and maybe this is more for children and teens than adults, because that's where I feel how I'm receiving and interpreting the school board debates over kind of teaching racism and slavery and settler colonialism and the extermination of indigenous peoples, all of that, is there seems to be a lot of backlash or antipathy towards the idea of the point of the lessons and the assigned textbooks, if you will, shouldn't be to make white kids feel guilty. And there seems to be a lot of backlash and response to that. And I think the questions that are raised certainly with that is, and I don't know what that's like in congregations like yours. I can say in some of the congregations I visited in the state where I live in Georgia, there is certainly, maybe not to that like ferocity, Susan, and to all of us, but there is certainly that. So there are several responses. One is that was the past and we've moved beyond all of that. So why are you so focused on that and teaching that to us, right? And I think so for me, that's not as hard a question to answer for me. I simply say I'm a historian. This is my area of research, and your pastors and session invited me to come. And so this is what I'm going to do for an hour. And then if, and that's what it is, right? But I do think the greater questions are, I think I like the way you put it with the reckoning, is I do genuinely think that there hasn't been a full-on, if reckoning is too strong a word, a full-on kind of grappling with like what the past was and kind of where we are today. And so I think one of the challenges, and we'll keep opening it up, is like, how do we move from a defensive posture to a posture of openness, to a posture of vulnerability, to a posture of recognition, and a posture of like wanting to pursue the goodness of God's work in racial justice. So one of the ironies, if you will, let's just take the Presbyterians in the United States. I'm not saying best denomination, best people, but that's who we are and where we are. It's a relatively small group. Probably, I want to say, across all the different Presbyterian denominations, probably less than 3 million out of 300 million. Probably maybe 2 million. I think the PCUSA is the largest at 1.1, 1.2 million. This other denomination, the PCA, Presbyterian Church in America, is the second largest, probably at 300 to 350,000. I think generally, Presbyterians actually don't agree on a lot of stuff. We don't agree on how to interpret the Bible, how to read the Bible. We don't agree on what's called a historicity, or did all the events that the Hebrew Bible, for example, attest to actually happen the way the Hebrew Bible describes them. There's some disagreement about that. We disagree about LGBTQ inclusion. We disagree about the fundamental question of who can preach at the pulpit. Can women preach at the pulpit? Should churches welcome queer and trans people as Christians? There's a lot of disagreement about all of that. Even environmentalism, there's a lot of disagreement. But there is actually agreement at a fundamental level about the sinfulness of racism. And there is fundamental agreement that racism.
Oh no, we seem to have lost him. Oh gosh. Now hold on. Hopefully, I'm sure he'll jump right back on.
Yep.
That's okay.
So anyways, long story, that's so it's exciting because there's a lot of agreement about needing to combat racism as Christians. But what's discouraging is there's not a lot of agreement about how. And so Susan, to all of us, I think I don't know that I have the right answers in terms of how. I think it's for every congregation to discern and decide best how we can contribute or participate in what we believe is like righteousness and justice and what God wants us to do. More often, I can actually share And what I've shared with you, Susan, and all of us, a lot of things that aren't working. And I think that's okay too. Not that these things aren't working, but to be honest, that these things are not working. I think one thing that is, so there's been a lot of investment in kind of equity training, for example, in the corporate world. Maybe some of you here on this call have received some of this training or are reading books like White Fragility by Robin DiAngelo. I think to me, and again, it's hard because news tends to sensationalize and pick like the most fierce opposition to it all. But I think generally it's working in some cases to help those who are wanting to do more, but in some ways it's also not working, that it's not really bringing people along. And so I don't think it's to judge that the books and the equity trainers and the experts are wrong, but it is to be honest to say, this might not work in my context. For example, one of the screenshots I shared with you is like, and again, it's hard because you wonder if it's sensationalized, how accurate is it? But teachers at one school really upset about this exercise they did in kind of pre-school year training about the privilege pie. And this idea that if I am white, I have this much privilege. And then if I'm cisgender, I have this much more privilege. If I grew up in the middle class and higher, I have this much more privilege. If I am male or a man of this, and there tends to be like, at my seminary, I would say largely exercises like that are somewhat helpful. Like they work. Right, Sarah, you can say even from your time at Columbia, that it would be helpful and it would lead to generative, vulnerable, good conversation, and it would help all of us. But I think it's to understand that in some contexts that might not be a good step one. It seems to me in that school district, that wasn't a good step one. And so again, it's not to criticize the exercise, but it's to understand maybe to Sarah and to all of us kind of reception. And it's hard though, because you also don't want reception to like dictate what you do, right? Like, what do they say at Columbia Seminary? We like to say a lot, Sarah, maybe we said it when you were here too. Some people attribute it to Walter Brueggemann, this Old Testament professor and scholar. Like the idea of ministry is to comfort the afflicted and to afflict the comfortable. Have y'all heard that? It's also attributed to poetry. I think there's a poet who says that. But then, but I don't know. And at seminary, we're all like, yeah, that's really awesome. We should do that. And then alumni come back 2-3 years later and they say, that didn't work. And so anyways.
Yeah, yes, I do remember hearing that. And I do remember it attributed to Dr. Brueggemann. Though much was attributed to Dr. Brueggemann. He's offered a lot, that's for sure. Joyce, I see your hand and I also see Amy's. So I'm going to go, Amy, I'm going to go to you first and then I'll come to you, Joyce.
Sure. Great lecture. Thank you so much. I'm curious sort of how you'd see, right? So if like we draw a line with, the trajectories that you were talking about like consolidation of power, thinking specifically about seminary education and entire congregations of Black and Brown folk who are locked out of that, particularly within, our tradition. So how would you see sort of the role of maybe shifting some of those power dynamics and like what role seminary education has to play in that? Like, are there ways that as a denomination we should be thinking about bringing other people in and giving them access to, because if we think about privilege pie, right? Like who gets to go to seminary, and thinking about congregations as being so segregated. Wonder what your thoughts are on that.
Oh yeah, thank you, Amy. Can I follow up real quick, Amy? I'm going to put you on the spot just for a moment.
Go for it.
I hear you, consolidation of power and questions about equity and access. So if seminaries were to make it more financially, that's just one barrier. There are several I think you've named. I think that's the one that seminaries, particularly seminaries with healthy endowments like mine, that's a barrier that can be lowered, if you will. Like, how far would that get us? Like, does that get us half the way there? Does that get us 5? Like, that's my question. Does that get us 5 steps to 100, or does that get 95 of the 100 steps?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. I mean, I don't know. I like, full disclosure, the impetus for the question comes, I come from higher ed and I know well the cost. And just, it's something that I wrestle with in my own field. And then I look at my Christian faith and I'm like, this is ridiculous. Like I work with these, I've worked with, as a community organizer, with brilliant African-American pastors who would love nothing more than to get top-notch theological training, and just being completely locked out of the most progressive seminaries. And it's just, yeah. I don't know. I'm just wondering what, there's only, working as someone who's in higher ed, there's only so far you can push from being inside the institution, right? In some ways it takes, those in the church or outsiders pushing to hold accountable for things like relaxing that endowment a little bit. But there's certainly ways, I would imagine, that a lot of our seminaries can find ways to loosen that. I don't know. Not responsible for the purse strings, but definitely curious.
Oh yeah, thanks, Amy. I think so let's just take our denomination, the PCUSA. So at one level, there's access to education, or equitable access to education. I think there also have been questions about equitable access to ordination. And so what happens in presbyteries, what happens in congregations. And so I think there are multiple layers, which I know you do too, as someone in higher ed. So that's all there. I can just share briefly from what I know of the history, and what I found really helpful to me is there was a caucus or a group within before reunion in 1983. There was people call them the Northern and the Southern Church. That's not quite exactly accurate, in that there were some congregations in the Southern states that were part of the predominantly Northern denomination, which was the United Presbyterian Church in the USA. And then the Southern Church was the Presbyterian Church in the US. Super confusing, right? They simply just said, we don't want the A. So we're PCUS. And the other group said, we're not going to be the PCUSA because that was an old name. So we're going to be the UPCUSA. And then when they reunited in 1983, you had the UPCUSA and the PCUS. And they said, we need new wineskins. So we're going to go with a totally new name that's never been used before. PC parentheses USA, because that's never been seen before. That's God's moving in us. But anyways, so in the UPCUSA in the 1970s, the Native American Consulting Committee, their caucus suggested, like, we don't want lower ordination standards, but we want different ordination standards that are better fitting to our social location and our cultural context. The idea of taking the same kind of exams and going through the same kind of procedures that were really built for, to your question, Amy, really built for white men, and ultimately perhaps opened up some for white persons of all gender identities, but still very white. So can we work together to create kind of equitable access, new standards and a new procedure and new processes? And to this date, that has not happened. I found their argument fairly convincing, but I think it's a minority opinion, even today in 2021 in the PCUSA. I share this, Amy, not to like kind of throw stones at someone else and take it off the seminaries, but just to point to the, I'm sorry. All right, I'm falling apart here for a moment, but to point to the kind of the larger structures and all that's in place. And then the question becomes like, what do congregations like yours do? Like, what do the minister members and the ruling elders who are commissioners at your presbytery, like, what can they do? I think, Amy, that's kind of my answer. There are so many different like things that need to happen. So I think the best thing is for all of them to be happening simultaneously, and hopefully with some kind of collaboration. Does that help, Amy? I know I didn't fully answer your question.
Yeah, no, that makes sense.
Joyce, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, thanks. In the first part of your lecture, you talked about the argument made by anti-abolition or by abolitionists from northern states, that in some cases they argued that that we should send slaves or Black people to Liberia, so that because the anti Black sentiment was just too great to overcome in this country, and I think that it is qualitatively different from the sense of from a sense that I also think is present in our denomination today, and among people of thoughtful people who are trying to be very accommodating today. It is different, but there's a little bit of a similar quality that I'm troubled by, and so I want to name that there is this sense in our denomination that we should accommodate people wanting to be with like people. And that's a tribalism, that there's a comfort in being with people who are like you. And this rears its head in all kinds of situations, including the conversations that our church, that a refugee welcome team is actively having with organizations that work with refugee resettlement. And the question is, where should we settle? Where should we direct our housing funds, right? Should it be in those parts of the city where they'll find other people who are from their same ethnic or national background, or should it be in a community that will be welcoming and will put forth resources, but of hospitality and to help people get on their feet, but that are very different, where the language, the culture, and the life experience is going to be very different from the refugees' experience. And so while I know that tribalism is different than racism, there is sort of a flip side, there's a connection between the two sentiments. And I just wanted to name that the sense of accommodating people who want to be, or who we think would want to be with people like themselves, is still a strong presence and voice among well-intentioned people. And I think there's even backing for that. Like, there are many statistics that show how communities, ethnic, similar communities, can really work together and help each other to become more socioeconomically stable. And so there are statistics like that. But I do wonder if this anti-Black racism is one version of just a universal human tribalism. You know what I mean? That is very prevalent and always has been. In the second part of your talk, you talked about how theological educational institutions like seminaries and maybe even schools in general haven't sufficiently grappled with the anger, and you named anger, about racism and slavery. And I'm wondering if part of that too is that they just haven't sufficiently grappled with how do we deal with anger about anything, because anger about sexism, anger about about any identity issues, or about abuses of power. I'm just wondering if part of the problem about this is that we haven't sufficiently grappled with how do we deal constructively and meaningfully with anger. Not just the object of our anger. So those are the things I'm just that are on my mind that your lecture raised.
Thanks, Joyce. Yeah, there's a lot there. I think I hear you on your latter point about anger. I think where I resonate with Lowen is like the more I study, he calls it racial slavery. I think it's also known as American enslavement, which is what Brian Stevenson calls it more recently. But I do think the one critique of the abolitionist movement was very much that like by your angry accusations, particularly of other Christians as evil and demonic and satanic and brutality and the like, that's not productive. That's not helping your movement. But it was so at one level, I think several historians would say like their anger was totally justified, that it really was just a horrible, unspeakably evil institution of slavery that needed to be abolished yesterday. And that all the other approaches of moderation and of collaboration and of working together, that they were not effective, that perhaps, like, I think it's the question of like how we understand progress. So for example, this one kind of theologian or historian, Reinhold Niebuhr was his name. He taught at Union Seminary in New York City in the 1940s. He did some work with labor unions in Detroit beforehand. Barack Obama said that he was his favorite theologian at one point. But he noted that in this book, I think in the 50s, he published it, The Irony of American History, is that like progress didn't happen like it didn't happen in a gradual kind of upward movement. That in every case where progress was made, it was not a movement of progress, but it was a drama of conflict, right? He called it the zigs and zags of history, that conflict is necessary for change. So I don't know. So I think it's bad if like seminaries like mine and congregation like yours, if it's always like, there's always a lot of conflict, that's probably not good, and always a lot of anger and people yelling at each other all the time. But I wonder, Joyce, I wonder what you think. I think the alternative is also not very productive, like having no conflict, of avoiding any kind of matter or discussion or anything that might create any kind of conflict, like for the sake of peace or unity. Like it seems to me that that doesn't work either, because I do think that was actually the Presbyterian denomination, the mainstream, the largest group, the PCUSA back then, before it divided Northern and Southern. I do think that was pretty much their approach. Like Methodists, for example, and Baptists split in 1844 and 1845. And so there was a lot of pressure at the Presbyterian Church USA General Assembly in 1845 to divide over slavery, but they didn't. And the idea was like, this is a better strategy, like among the Northern Presbyterians. Like we can still worship together and talk together and like gently persuade one another. But none of that actually ever happened. Like slavery was not solved apart from, as we all know, a really bloody, awful conflict. So anyways, I wrestle with that too. I wrestle with kind of Niebuhr's notion of, I think hunting for conflict is bad, but I think avoiding conflict in any kind of congregation or seminary is also bad. Like, so what's that balance? The problem, Joyce, and to all of us is the balance is probably like a super thin tightrope, to be honest and realistic about it. Anyways, I don't know if that gets at all your comments, Joyce. I appreciate that. I'm sorry that I don't have
Sure. No, thank you.
answers.
Thank you very much. No, I think you know, your comments about conflict are making me realize, like, you know, in my graduate studies, there was always a lot of tension and I would say critique, but not necessarily conflict. And so I think there's a difference between being critical and sharpening and taking a very precise and critical, rigorous approach. That's different than just conflict, I think. Friends, I have to go pick up someone from the airport, so I am going to go, but thank you very much, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you, Joyce. And if y'all have a few more minutes, I think we've got a good discussion. Dr. Yu, do you have a few more minutes? That was great. Amy, thank you for your comment in the chat. We'll draw our attention to that. And then Stu, you've got your hand raised.
You know, well, there is a touch of irony in the fact that Joyce is leaving because, well, first of all, thank you, Dr. Yu. I love this, and thank you, Susan and Sarah and whomever all was involved in having you here. And yeah, we could talk for about 5 more hours, or all semester. But anyway, the reason I brought Joyce up, because one of the one thing that I think I try to wrap my head around is how much it seems to me that economy and religion, like especially back in the Civil War days and slavery and whatnot, everything leaned to economy, and almost religion was used to justify the reasoning behind why we have to do things was because of the economy, and that seems to run counterintuitive to religion, or at least to me. And I thought, and Dr. Yu, when you said how, Susan, you had brought up reckoning and how, searching what is sort of a reckoning. And Dr. Yu, you stated how we take a defensive posture rather than leaning into the goodness and all the uplifting parts of our religion. And I started to think about in reckoning, and when you had when you spoke of Benjamin Palmer, I thought to myself, wait, Benjamin Palmer, that's the Rhodes College guy, or that's Rhodes College. And then I knew that, oh yeah, they're reckoning with taking down his name from one of their buildings. And so my question was kind of to Joyce too, about how an institution handles its own form of reckoning. And I agree with your comments on how it's important to shine a light on what, and we are a Reformed church, and we shine a light and go from there. But it's always interesting to me how institutions and higher eds, handle this reckoning, of race. And I think, and from the Rhodes College standpoint, there's the whole, and I had talked to Joyce about this a while ago about some other things, and I talked a little bit about Rhodes, and she pointed me to Steve Haynes as a lecturer there who did a lecture on Benjamin Palmer and the curse of Ham and the justification for slavery. And like, is that back then, all those, was that the primary, yeah, go look at the, book of Genesis and Ham, and therefore slavery. Is that kind of the only real place where folks anchor their racism and justification, which again is you're justifying economy over humanity, and that seems counterintuitive, to religion. So yeah, I mean, there's a lot going on here and there, but I'm fascinated by that the justifications for racism and slavery in religion seem to be so weak, yet at the same time so strong for those who wrap themselves up in religion to justify racism or slavery or tribalism, like Joyce was getting to, where we, I'm a white Anglo-Saxon man, so I am, the divine person here. So, all right, I will stop. I could keep going, but I will stop.
Thanks, Stu. That's really great commentary. Let's see, to respond. Briefly, I can say, I do think white Presbyterians and other white Christians defending slavery, I do think there was more consensus on a literalist interpretation of the Bible and human history to defend slavery. It was this idea that instances of slavery with over excessive physical corporal punishment and it's clear in the history, the rampant sexual violence against enslaved Black women, like those sins needed to be reformed, but they did not call for a total reformation of the system itself. I think the challenge you have when you look at systems is, to your point on the economy, I think it's something that Christians wrestle with today, maybe differently than in the antebellum period. But for example, antebellum US capitalism was not, there was very little scriptural defense for it. Do you know what I mean? Like even some pro-slavery white Presbyterians acknowledge that like our system of economics is actually pretty counter to Acts chapter 2. And the idea that all the believers were together and had everything in common. I think that's verses 42 to 47. Like, I think even today in 2021, so it's the question of like how do we apply the truths and the principles of the Bible to our present context, and to acknowledge the necessary complexity, and to acknowledge that like there isn't a kind of simple answer or rubric to applying the Bible to today. And I think that's hard, Stu, and to all of us for a lot of Christians, because it runs counter to this other theological claim that Reformed and Presbyterian Christians hold to as well, is they called it back then, we don't call it that now, but they called it the perspicacity of Scripture or the gospel, like the clarity of it. Like the Bible is super simple. It's a message of a triune God who loved fallen humankind and sent Jesus into the world. You know, like that's a message. You don't need a fancy education to understand that. The simplest illiterate farmer to the most literate like biology professor can understand that. That's the beauty of the Bible and the Christian message. And so the idea that actually that part may be true, but a whole lot of other things about the Bible and how we apply it to the complexity of 1840 or 2021, it's not straight line, you know? And I think that really troubles folks. Am I wrong on that, Stu, to everyone? I think it's hard for folks to hold those two things in productive tension. It's either one is true and the other is not, or the other is true and this one is not. It's not possible that both these things can both be true. I think that's one of the dilemmas that we're facing today and that they faced back then.
That's a great answer. And I need to remind myself that, you know, all the time. And the literal, and there are folks, right, whose interpretation, you know, is literal. You know, I totally disagree with the constitutional, like Antonin Scalia, you know, a constitutional scholar, but he can be absolutely right about things that he believes in and interprets. And, you know, I have to sort of keep that in mind. It makes no sense to me, but that folks can have these interpretations of things. Because, right, it's so simple to me.
Do we have any, maybe we can have one more question. I am curious then, I'm going to jump in. I'm curious, and I don't want to tie this in a bow because I don't think that's what this is about. I mean, I think you raising the fact that there's a tension here and the complexity, and I think I've heard you say again and again and again, it's contextual, you know, how we're responding to this. But I think, you know, overall, what I am also hearing you say is that there is a reckoning or a needing to look at our history and go beyond trying to find the easiest, you know, quote unquote, easiest response to why this happened. And I wonder, and I feel like that is not just in the church, that's in so many different sectors. And I'm curious because I know that the church learns, you know, can learn valuable tools, not just from ourselves, but from those, you know, society around us. Like, have you seen any place where you've seen this kind of historical reckoning happening? And obviously understanding that it's so contextual to that, but have you seen any place where you have seen that really work in what you say, oh, that's what that could look like there? I mean, I'm just curious.
Oh, thanks, Sarah. I don't know. Again, you're right, because it's so it is very contextual and specific. I think
like I wonder, go ahead.
No, you please.
Well, I mean, I guess one of the things I think about is, and I think we hearken back to this a lot, right? But the kind of the truth and reconciliation model in South Africa of like, and that was not necessarily reckoning. Well, I mean, maybe it was to a certain degree reckoning with our history, but it's also reckoning with the things that happened to us directly. I wonder if that kind of, if there's a if there's like a storytelling that we can, that.
Oh yeah, okay.
I don't know. I mean,
yeah. Sarah, I hear you, Sarah. I think so. One thing that's been pretty encouraging to me, again, me too, I don't want to kind of put a bow on it and, you know, but I do think what's exciting in the PCUSA, for some things that might not be exciting, what is exciting is congregations are more and more like specifically contextually discerning for themselves, like in the pursuit of racial justice. Like, here's one just issue, like through the 1990s, and some of you will know more about this than me, when I read General Assembly minutes and I see all that was published by the PCUSA, really the emphasis was multiculturalism. Every individual congregation needs to be, I think the number is 80%. A church that is 80% one kind of dominant group, let's say 80% Black or 80% white, 80% Asian American, like the goal is to get under 80, because 80 means you're monocultural. But if you're under 80 and you have 1/5 of your congregation is of another racial ethnic group, that really was kind of the goal. Like, let's all be multicultural. And ultimately the goal of that is, the idea behind that, I think, is like, we need our worship on earth to look more like what it'll look like in heaven. That's the theological claim. And the social justice claim, if you will, is like, the more we rub shoulders and worship together, for example, predominantly white congregations, the more we have more members of color in our congregation, it will help us, like, not just kind of pursue justice in a superficial way, but it'll be more relational and interpersonal and the like. So those things. But I think what's happening now is, I think some congregations are saying that's one way, but another way is, we're not going to be a multicultural church. That's just not realistic. And that's not even perhaps how God is calling us. That's not what our neighborhood looks like. But can we be an anti-racist church? You know, can we be a church that leverages the endowment, the power, the influence that we have in a particular local neighborhood or community? And can we use that for good? Right. And so I think that's exciting that some congregations are discerning and saying, I don't think that's a bad thing for a congregation to say. That's not like us being multiracial and having lots of different music and lots of different preaching, that's not it for us. But for us, it's going to be to use what we have, and it's to worship in the ways that are most familiar to us, but to do unfamiliar and uncomfortable things like in the world. I think one challenge to that, Sarah, and to all of us, is that there still is the wrestling with the question of politics and Christianity. Like, I think what's helped me is the work of, and you've read some too from seminary too, and I know your group is reading it, Black liberation theology, Indigenous American theology. It's this idea that it's not so much that we want our gospel to be political, but like, the only way we're going to truly flourish as co-equal children of God in the United States is through political means. Like, how else are we going to get access to clean water and access to a livable wage and access to equal opportunities in education? Ultimately, yes, I want my congregation to pray for it, and I want my congregation to support me in it, but ultimately it's going to be through legislation. Like, that's the air we breathe, if you will, in this country. Like, no major social change and reform will happen outside of politics. I think there's a lot of good things that can happen outside of politics, but ultimately this like super like separation, and I experienced it, and Sarah, maybe you did when you're at Columbia too. Like, we have students that come to seminary now and they say, I'm not going to ever preach politics from my pulpit. I'm not going to ever engage in politics as a minister of word and sacrament. And I don't know. I don't say that that's a wrong view, but I think for me, the question is, what are your goals in ministry? Like, how are we going to get to a more racially equitable United States? Like, maybe there are, and I don't want to like poo-poo on this kind of apolitical stance. Like, Stu, what you were saying, I think for some people, they really hold it near and dear to their Christianity. So for me to say like, that's a terrible version of Christianity, that's not very helpful. That doesn't get us anywhere. So it's more like, okay, you're not going to be a political preacher in your definition of politics. Like, then how else are we going to get to the change that we want to see? And there might be, like, Sarah, you can tell. I'm just going to be honest. I don't think that that's a really good view.
Yeah.
That's
Right.
terrible. This is recorded, so
Right.
that's terrible for me to
No,
say.
that's it's
But
okay. It's
personally,
okay.
I don't think that that's a really good view. And I think some of it
Refreshing.
comes from my own kind of racial, ethnic immigrant background. But nonetheless, for those who have that view, I want to respect it. And I want to see how that view can help us get to a common goal. Is that a fair thing to say without me? Yeah, you
Yeah.
can tell I'm still wrestling with how to engage that question of politics and Christianity. Some, Sarah, will say, and some of our students say this, I'm going to engage in politics, but not partisanship.
Right.
Like, that's another way to do it. But then I'm like, we're a two-party country.
That's right.
Like, what's that mean? That just seems to me like a play on words.
Right.
Is that I'm being terrible right now, but
Okay.
I think you all
No.
understand my own. You can see my own dilemmas on how to engage
Mhm.
these questions.
Mhm. Yeah, I think that's a very real question. And you asked, I mean, that was definitely a huge part of our conversation with Stan Saunders and Chuck Campbell and many of the different teachers that I had a privilege to work with there. And also the challenge that thinking about politics, that thinking about the gospel also as political. I mean, thinking about scripture as political, as necessarily engaging with the world and policies in the world around us, and bringing our Christian lens and our views of salvation and justice and gospel, hospitality to that. And so but it is a challenge, and I hear that debate, and I know that I've served in different places where that debate looks different, where there are some that are much more eager to lean into that, and there are some that aren't. And so it's a good, thank you for your honesty in that struggle, because I think it really does say that we as Christians have a responsibility to be moral actors in the world around us, that at least that's how I would frame that, that there is a call in our understanding of who God is to be moral agents in not just the building or the community of the church, but in the place in which we inhabit. So I appreciate that. And I heard Susan say that was refreshing to have that, to be able to be honest and say that. So thank you for grappling with that with us. I appreciate that. Well, I know, folks, that there are some that really do need to step off, and we said 4:00. So thank you for holding on. I wish we could keep going. Dr. Yu, this really has just been a gift to us all, and we hope to be able to invite you back sometime in person so that we can host you at Swarthmore Pres, and that would be a wonderful thing too. So thank you all for your participation with us on this afternoon, and I invite you to definitely continue to engage with the adult formations work and what they're doing, and any of the places where we're trying to really frame this conversation at Swarthmore Pres. So, and we do have one more lecture in our series, which is going to be November 21st. Sorry, I just realized I didn't have my calendar in front of me, so I want to make sure I'm giving you the right date. November 21st, Claudio Carvales is coming to Swarthmore Pres. He's in New York, and he's going to look with us at worship and anti-racism and practices of liturgy and worship. So we hope that you will join us that day for his work with us too. So blessings upon each of you. Dr. Yu, blessings upon you. Thank you for your work and for your time with us.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.